All right, YouTube, listen. So, Pantheon is coming out tomorrow, and whether or not you're somebody who's played Destiny for a long time, or you're somebody who's just jumping into the game for the first time, there's lots of stuff going on. The new expansion's about to come out. Whatever the case is, Pantheon is a new raid style gauntlet, rapid fire, boss to boss to boss to boss style game mode where you're going to be doing just that. You're going to be fighting raid bosses. And it's going to be, like I said, in a gauntlet kind of rapid fire succession. Our understanding is that Bungie is taking numerous raid bosses from the raids that exist in the game now. They're kind of throwing them into exactly that, a Pantheon or a back to back to back to back encounter style mode. And they're actually adding some unique rewards. Well, I shouldn't say unique, but they're adding the raid specific rewards. You'll be able to get some of the raid exotics from these. You'll be able, I believe, to get the master mode version of some of the legendary weapons as well. So there's some incentive there for me personally. The experience of the mode, they are adding some light level ceilings to the mode. The mode's going to get progressively harder week to week to week to week up until the final raid launches. And also, there's some cool emblems if you do beat the various difficulties, which for me, I beat all these encounters and raids before. So seeing them in harder, more difficult versions in this kind of style of mode seems very interesting for somebody like me who loves to raid and loves these kind of challenges in Destiny. Now, with that being said, there is a plethora of information out there about how to perform well in raids, the best builds to use, how to function as a human being in Destiny and contribute to the team. And I figured that I would take a crack at kind of the, in general, what you need to know basics for how to go into Pantheon or go into any raid for any instance and have just enough knowledge to make use of, your guardian, the weapons you have, and contribute to the fire team. Now, this has some numbers and some things in here specifically. If this looks too complicated for you, trust me, just stick with me for a few minutes and I will hopefully speak in a way that dumbs it down and makes it easy to understand. But I will also level with you. This is a game mode that is going to challenge you. You're going to be facing these raid style bosses in these 6-man groups. If you've never done a raid before in Destiny, I would highly encourage you to look at all the other plethora of guides and raid encounter walkthroughs on YouTube before jumping into Pantheon. Again, most, if not all, of these bosses are already in the game in their normal raids. You can do the raids on normal mode before jumping into Pantheon, where they're adding harder mechanics and harder modifiers. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and just kind of run down what I have in front of me here. And like I said, I'll try to break it down and make it easy first before we start delving into each of the individual points that I have. So a general rule to being effective in a raid boss environment is understanding kind of how DPS works. In every encounter that we're going to be getting in Pantheon, pretty much every encounter, there's usually a set of mechanics you have to solve, a puzzle, so to speak, and then there is a tight window in order to do damage to the boss. And in that tight window of damage, your goal as a player is to maximize how much damage you are doing and kind of how fast you can do it in. Because in some cases you're going to be getting damage windows. I know, for instance, one of the bosses tomorrow is going to be the Explicator from Root of Nightmare. You have a 7-second damage window. You have to understand, how the weapon you're using is working, what the other debuffs and weapons other people around you are using. So it would behoove you to understand at a baseline kind of what's going on. So the general rule to DPS in Destiny is that buffs and debuffs do not necessarily stack with each other. So if there are, 2 or 3 different effects on an enemy that is making them take more damage, usually only the one that is making them take the most damage is going to supersede. So for example, if you have a debuff on an enemy that makes them take 15% more damage, and then somebody takes another weaken effect and puts 30% more weaken effect, they don't multiply together, they don't add together, just that 30% will kind of supersede, and that will be how much damage is being increased and taken by that enemy. This works the exact same for the player. In, like I said, most situations of the game, you're not going to be having, a buff from this ability, from this ability, from that ability, all of them multiplying together in some complicated algorithm, and then that gives you your damage. No. As far as buffs, you will have whatever the strongest buff that is on your character at that time will be what affects your damage. There are some intricacies and ways that buffs do stack with each other, but thankfully it's not that often. There's really only one kind of stacking mechanic you'll have to be aware of, which is really easy. It's really simple to understand. We'll talk about it here shortly. But generally speaking, you can put one kind of effect on an enemy that will weaken them, and you can have one, maybe two effects on you that will make you do more damage. And you as a Guardian have to understand how to make sure you're getting the strongest weaken effect on that enemy, while also giving you the strongest weapon buffs or super buffs to make sure that you're dealing the most amount of damage possible. So looking at raid setups, now every single boss in Destiny is going to have different mechanics, different arenas. So how effective certain weapons or abilities or supers are going to be in different scenarios will of course vary. The goal of what I have here in front of me is to inform you, how effective these are at a baseline, and then you can decide which one you would like to use as far as abilities and weapons and perks go in different situations. A perfect example or kind of use case of this situation is if you're fighting a boss that is up in your face and you look at my guide and say, all these perks for rocket launcher seem awesome, let me get a god rocket launcher. You're going to be using it against a boss who's in your face. I ain't gonna say nothing. You might get kicked. But my point is, use the information here to determine how to look for different kinds of weapons, how to decide what kind of build you're going to be using in a boss fight. That's the purpose of this guide. So let's really quickly go through kind of the key or the legend. So anytime that you see an orange number in this screen, that is something that is going to directly affect the damage of your weapon that you're using in your hand, your weapon damage. Anytime you see a green number, that is going to be damage resistance. There are some things in the game that will give you buffs and damage resistance, and anytime you see green, that's telling you how much damage resistance is that ability or whatever it is giving to you. Anytime you see purple or kind of a light pinkish, that is the weaken effect. So that is something that is going to be weakening or increasing the amount of damage that a enemy is receiving from your team. Again, typically you can have one thing that's making you stronger and deal more damage, and one thing that is making that enemy take more damage. And finally, there's a few situations on this guide where you'll see a blue number, which indicates super regeneration or ability regeneration. There's a few of these that are important in the game. You and your fire team might use them, but again, we'll go over those specific cases when we get to them. So really quickly running through the super abilities. So when you kind of build a framework of what kind of character you have, what kind of build you want to use, a lot of the time it's going to be based on the super ability that you use. So for example, if you're wondering what exotic armor should I use in a boss fight, more than likely than not, if you have a certain super or ability active or equipped, that is going to then tell you what kind of exotic armor piece that you would want to wear. So for example, the super abilities that are in the game, these are the ones that you are more than likely going to need to see or be familiar with in a raid. Well of Radiance, it is the go-to for the support damage providing warlock super. For those of you who aren't aware, it makes a big circle in the ground that will constantly heal you and also provide you a damage buff. As you can see here, it's going to give you 25% weapon damage, and it's going to give you about 10% resistance, but it's also healing you the whole time. Please, if you are in a raid and you see somebody stick their sword in the ground in a huge yellowish orange circle of fire, stand in it. It is going to heal you. It's going to give you damage. Another super ability that you're going to be seeing and hearing is Tether. Tether is the strongest weaken effect in the game, only tied with a heavy weapon. But Tether is going to be a hunter super. Shoot a bow and arrow into the ground. Anything standing near where that arrow lands, where the tether lands, is going to be weakened and take 30% increased damage. As far as the duration of tether, it's affected by a few different variables. If you're only shooting it at one boss, I would say you'll probably get anywhere from 10 to 15 seconds out of it. If you're shooting it into a cluster of enemies or smaller enemies, it seems to last longer. That's just my experience. I don't have an exact timer, but tether for the hunter is going to make a big difference and make that enemy take much more damage. Ward of Dawn. Ward of Dawn is a Titan super. It is a literal bubble that you will stand in. And then when you're in Ward of Dawn, you can't shoot out of it, but you are extremely resistant while standing inside of it. So it's kind of a panic. This is if there's a huge damage event or move that a boss is going to do, or if you're just in a stressed situation, you can pop a Ward of Dawn. When you're when you have Ward of Dawn, you have an overshield to your inside Ward of Dawn. You are going to be taking 25% damage reduction, so you're going to be taking more damage. Ward of Dawn also provides you the same exact damage buff as well as Radiance, which is 25%. So there's no reason that you would want to stack a Well of Radiance and a Ward of Dawn together. Again, they don't stack per se. Ward of Dawn does give you more damage reduction, but you can't shoot out of it. So, there's the trade-off. Sentinel Shield. So Sentinel Shield doesn't see a whole lot of usage, at least from my experience today. Essentially, the alternate version of Ward of Dawn is a shield that a Titan could opt to carry. So it is a super that they have to be using during a damage phase. If you're standing behind a Titan who is holding that shield up, you are going to be getting a 40% damage increase, and you're also going to be getting a 40% damage reduction. So Sentinel Shield is, looking at this, the strongest kind of buff and active damage resistance in the game in a super. The trade-off, of course, is that you're going from 6 people shooting a boss to 5, because that one person has to be actually holding the shield. Another thing to note is that the person who is holding it, if all 5 of your teammates are standing behind you and you are actively blocking for them, it will drastically increase the duration of that super. So optimally, if your team is going to use a Sentinel Shield, you are going to want to make sure that everybody is using it so that that one person gets the most duration and your team gets the most benefit from it. Another super ability to kind of mention here is Thunder Crash. So Thunder Crash is a one-off Titan super where it's just a quick burst of damage that the Titan usually will slam into the enemy. I don't play Titan. I don't main Titan. I have a Titan. I don't main Titan though, but Thunder Crash is usually also talked about as well as kind of a one-off, just quick burst of damage. You will often see, if your team wipes during Pantheon, any point during a raid, that people with Thunder Crash will usually have an extra several 100,000 damage from that one Thunder Crash. So it is also worth noting. And for some reason, I didn't type in here, but I guess I will in real time if it lets me. So another super is, of course, Golden Gun. This is a one-off super from the Hunter. There's all kinds of other supers in the game, but these are the ones that you're going to be needing to be familiar with during the raid. So that's the one super for hunters that kind of gives them an immediate quick burst of damage. There's other supers as well that exist that can do damage, but these to me are the kind of the ones that you see most of. And again, if anything in this list you disagree with, or you have difference of opinion, or maybe the numbers I got wrong, feel free to correct me or leave a critique in the comments. So those are the supers that you're going to be seeing most in a raid type environment, a boss type environment. If you play a class that is capable of using any of these supers, I would highly advise you to become familiar with that super. Also become familiar with any of the exotics that affect that super as well. Later on, we'll talk about some of the particular exotics that do go with some of those supers. But for now, main thing is, if you're going into the raid tomorrow, have an idea of what these supers do, because they will greatly benefit your team. And to be quite honest with you, there's multiple raid encounters that just exist in normal raids that probably couldn't be beaten, or would be much, much, much harder to beat without the use of those supers. Okay, so let's move on to some of the notable buffs and debuffs. So these are just general purpose buffs and debuffs that you're going to be seeing and you're going to become familiar with as you're playing around these kinds of encounters. So for Solar, there are 3 buffs that you're going to be seeing primarily. So Restoration and Cure. Restoration is literally just a passive heal. You have Restoration, you're going to be healing. Cure is just an instant burst of healing. And then another thing with Restoration and Cure is you can actually have multiple stacks of these. So for example, if you have Restoration and you see a ×2 next to it, it's going to be healing you at a much faster rate. Same with Cure. If you see Cure ×2 pop up, then somebody probably threw a healing grenade on you, or somebody gave you some quick burst of Cure that would keep you alive. Radiant is a damage buff. It is tied with Well of Radiance and Ward of Dawn. Again, they won't stack. But if you have a source of Radiant, then it will give you a 25% damage increase to all of your weapons. So Radiant is good to use. Another quick note, Golden Gun, the marksman version of Golden Gun, which most hunters would use for damage, it does actually stack with Radiant. So if you're using Golden Gun, make sure you have some way to get Radiant before using it, because giving yourself a 25% buff with Golden Gun is pretty substantial. Woven Mail. So Woven Mail is actually primarily there's no other effects it gives to the wearer other than a 45% damage reduction. Now, Woven Mail has actually gone through a few different changes and nerfs. 45% is the most recent one that I can see. If anybody has different information, if it's 35% or maybe if it's 55%, please let the everybody know in comments. But Woven Mail is going to give you a pretty substantial just damage reduction if you have Woven Mail. If you have somebody on your team who can give you Woven Mail, there's an exotic weapon that can give Woven Mail. Or if you are playing Strand, the subclass Strand, there is an aspect, or excuse me, a fragment that you can get Woven Mail anytime that you pick up an orb of light on the ground, which you're going to be getting a lot of orbs. So Woven Mail is useful for those situations of just having general damage reduction. Now, debuffs. So debuff, the weakened debuff. So generally speaking, whenever you hear the word weaken, it's going to be 15%. Void 3.0, any of the purple subclass, lots of things weaken. There is a way you can make your grenades weaken enemies. There's a way you can have little floating rift orbs. Child of the Old Gods is what that's called. That can also weaken enemies, but 15% is what kind of the standard for weaken means. Suppressed is where enemies really can't use any of their abilities. If, for instance, you suppress an enemy who shoots rockets or throws grenades at you, you probably won't be seeing that until that suppression ends. Disorientation or blind is what some of the community knows. It literally, enemy can't do anything. They're just blinded. They're going to cower. Most of the bosses can't be blinded or disoriented, but a lot of the smaller adds can be blinded and disoriented, which can make a difference in a fight. Okay, so some of the notable weapons. So these are going to be some of the exotic weapons that you'll probably see thrown a lot around raids. If you can get these weapons before you attempt a raid or Pantheon, it would be greatly beneficial. You will become a huge asset to your team. If you can't get any of these, then at least knowing what they are, if they are referred to, will of course help out as well. So Divinity is a special arc trace rifle. And Divinity will place a cage onto an enemy that it is being shot at, and that cage kind of functions as another place you could score precision hits or like a headshot. If you have an enemy that has a really small crit spot, then somebody on the team could use Divinity to basically make a new crit spot that everybody could take advantage of and shoot. Generally speaking, Divinity is going to give a 15% weaken effect to that enemy. So if you're shooting that enemy, you're going to be getting 15% more damage because they're taking more. Now, there's an interesting little hint, or I guess way to think about Divinity. So some bosses in the game, when you shoot them in their head, will take, for example, 3 times damage. And sometimes whenever you shoot an enemy with the Divinity, the actual bubble or the cage that it makes will not give the same benefit as shooting that enemy in the head would. You'll be doing lower damage, but it'll be easier to hit the cage. So it's a trade-off. If your team is very effective and accurate to hit that enemy's crit spot, then it may not be worth using Divinity, because if you can hit the cage, great, but you're going to be doing less damage. If you can hit the headshots, maybe you should trade the Divinity off and use something else. But generally speaking, you're going to see Divinity used for bosses that move around a lot, that have small crit spots. So that's what Divinity is. Gallarhorn is the exotic rocket launcher that was famous in Destiny 1. In Destiny 2, it was brought back. And pretty much what you have to know about Gallarhorn is it is a substantial buff to anybody else in your team using rocket launchers. So the way that it works is if you're standing next to somebody and they shoot a Gallarhorn, you're going to get a buff that says Wolfpack rounds. And what Wolfpack rounds actually does is it is going to take the rocket launcher that you have, a legendary rocket launcher, it can't be an exotic one, it has to be a purple one. It is going to take the legendary rocket launcher that you have, and they are going to gain Wolfpack rounds. And what that does is when you shoot an enemy with your rocket, there's going to be 7, 8, I don't exactly know how many of them, smaller projectiles that will kind of go out and either kill adds, or they will all just circle back and hit that same boss again. So if somebody has a Gallarhorn in your fire team in a raid, then you should be using a rocket launcher, because it's going to give about a 20% bonus of damage to that rocket launcher. And this is actually one of those unique situations where the 20% buff to your rocket is something that does stack with the Well of Radiance, the Ward of Dawn, the Sentinel Shield. So that 20% right there is actually something that can stack because it's treated as a weapon buff and not a general buff. So Gallarhorn, exotic rocket launcher. If you see somebody using it or you're using it, make sure everybody in your fire team is using a good purple legendary rocket launcher, and that's a pretty good damage buff as well. Lumina is an exotic hand cannon that can give you a blessing. I'm not sure of the exact terminology, but it basically gives you a buff if somebody shoots you with it that deals 35% increased weapon damage. Lumina is, again, an exotic hand cannon. Somebody could use that, and it actually shoots. If they shoot and a bunch of people are clumped together, everybody will get that buff. So Lumina is pretty effective, but of course, you do have to trade off an exotic slot for Lumina. Your fire team can kind of make that decision. Now, Tractor Cannon is another source of 30% weaken. Again, you are basically giving up the ability for somebody to use a heavy weapon because it is a heavy shotgun essentially. But for that damage, the enemy is going to be 30% weaker. So, you know, if there's a good damage combination that person can use, maybe they're using a golden gun, maybe they're thunder crash, maybe they're using another damage special or primary weapon. Tractor Cannon will do a 30% debuff to the enemy that makes them take more damage. So Tractor Cannon is also a notable mention as well. Now, Izanagi's Burden and Wither Horde, these are two notable mentions because they don't do anything special as far as buffing or debuffing an enemy. But what you'll see a lot of players do, and if you have these weapons, what you could do is you can actually leverage these weapons when you're doing damage. So what a lot of players will do to maximize damage is they'll have like a rocket launcher, a grenade launcher, and they'll shoot either all the shots they can. They'll switch to the Izanagi's, they'll switch to a Wither Horde, they'll shoot a shot of that, and then they'll switch back to their rocket. And if you have some of the right perks that automatically reload your weapons, if you have the catalyst for Wither Horde, you can actually get into a cycle where you shoot one, swap to the other, shoot it, swap to the other, shoot it, and you kind of just create this loop of swapping back and forth. And doing this is a really, really, really effective way of dealing damage. It does take a lot more extra steps than just standing there shooting a rocket launcher over and over again. But if you have these weapons or you see other people mentioning these weapons, more than likely they're shooting something really powerful, switching to that weapon, shooting it, and then just doing that loop over and over again. Really high burst damage if you use these kinds of strategies, but it is some extra steps. If you're confident with it, there's a few guides out there that kind of teach you the ways to swap between these. All right, so now let's move on to some of the perks or things that make legendary weapons good. Now, specifically, we're focusing on some of the things you're going to see from the heavy weapon variety. If you're talking about special weapons or primary weapons doing damage, you know, those are going to be in situations where, you know, the boss is only like a few HP points away from dying, but most of the damage, 99% of the damage, is probably going to come from heavies. And if you have a heavy rocket launcher, you have a heavy grenade launcher, if you have a heavy linear fusion rifle, forgot what it was called, then these are some of the general perks that you're going to be looking for. These are the ones I quickly glanced at in my vault of the ones I have. There's all kinds of perks out there in the game that do some things that could increase, you know, how effective your weapons are. But these are the ones I could pick and choose from. You get a weapon that drops with one of these that's in your heavy slot, pay attention. It could be effective. So the first perk on here is auto loading. Literally the example I just gave, where somebody's using Izanagi Wither Horde and they're swapping back and forth. Auto loading is what lets you do that. Auto loading lets you shoot a shot or shoot a few bullets of a grenade launcher, for example, switch to another weapon, and then only after about a second or two, you can switch back and that weapon has reloaded itself. It has auto loaded itself. So that's what auto loading does. It's very effective if you are somebody who swaps between weapons during a damage phase. Bait and switch. The way that bait and switch works is you shoot an enemy with your other two weapons, switch to the weapon with bait and switch, and then it's going to have 30% increased damage for about 10 seconds. I think it's a pretty lengthy buff, and it's very easy to activate. So bait and switch is good on grenade launchers, rocket launchers. If you can get it on a linear fusion rifle, it's good on there too. Now, Envious Assassin, Reconstruction, Clown Cartridge, Overflow. These next four perks all primarily focus on increasing the size of your magazine. Having more bullets, grenade launchers, shots is always better. Keeps you from having to reload. Now, Envious Assassin is, in my opinion, the best in the game right now. The way that Envious Assassin works is you'll get rapid kills with your other weapons. Then you'll switch to your heavy weapon or switch to whatever weapon has the Envious Assassin perk on it, and it will overflow the magazine, for example. And it will do this up to 200%, which is about 3 times the normal mag size. So a practical example of this is if you have a grenade launcher that has, normally holds 6 shots, and you get a bunch of rapid kills with your other weapons, switch to that heavy grenade launcher that has Envious on it, and suddenly it's gone from 6 to 18. It is tripled in size because of this perk. So Envious Assassin is very good for having pretty substantial mag sizes, and in my opinion, it's a pretty easy perk to activate as long as there are other adds to kill to activate that perk. Reconstruction, it is something that will slowly over time reload the magazine, and if you let it reload past the normal mag size, it will actually load to double over time. It's a little bit slower. It's something you have to wait on, but you don't have to worry about getting kills. If you're in a boss fight where there's not a lot of adds to kill to proc Envious Assassin, then Reconstruction will just automatically work for you. Clown Cartridge, reload the weapon, and whenever you reload it, it is going to either get 10 to 50% extra shots in whatever magazine it is. Clown Cartridge doesn't roll on too many things anymore. It used to roll on a bunch of rockets and grenade launchers, but if you have one that gets this perk, you reload the weapon, it's going to get a few extra shots. That's the way it works. Overflow, basically the way Overflow works is whenever you pick up a special brick, green brick, or purple brick on the ground, a heavy brick, just picking that brick up will overflow the weapon with this perk, and it will have up to 120% extra shots in there. Now, Explosive Light. Explosive Light is a perk that you can get on grenade launchers or rocket launchers. The way that it works on grenade launchers is you're going to be getting about a 60% increase in damage, and for rockets, it's about a 25% increase in damage. Now, grenade launchers and rockets have one thing you should know. So whenever the grenade or the rocket projectile actually hits an enemy, there's a little bit of damage from the actual impact, and then there's some damage from the blast or the explosion. Now, whenever a explosive light perk is on a grenade launcher, that only affects the explosion. So if the grenade hits the enemy and does 10 damage, the 60% is not going to touch that 10 damage. It's only going to be the explosion damage that it actually buffs. For rockets, 25% is done to, I believe, both the impact and the explosion. So just a thing to note, rocket launchers and grenade launchers have an impact of the actual projectile and the explosion. So 2 things happen whenever a shot is shot of one of those weapons. Now, Surrounded is going to give 40% extra damage to whatever weapon it has surrounded on it when you are surrounded by, I believe, 2, 3 or more enemies nearby. When it's on a sword, you are going to be getting a 35% buff in damage. If it's on a grenade launcher or a rocket, then you're going to be getting about 35% extra damage for the explosion, and the impact of the rocket or the grenade on the enemy is going to do about 40% extra damage. So Surrounded is a pretty good perk as far as damage goes. However, it is used in situations where there's lots of enemies around you. If it's just you and a boss, Surrounded's not going to do anything for you. If there's a few thrall or enemies running around, then, Surrounded could be your go-to. So that's the perks for DPS on legendaries. Now, one thing to note is I mentioned earlier that there's really only one situation where you have to worry about perks or buffs kind of stacking with each other, and it applies to weapon perks. So any of those perks that I just listed, or any of the perks that you find on a weapon that you pick up in the game, if there is a perk that increases the damage of that weapon for some duration or some time, or if you satisfy some requirement like kill clip or rampage, those perks do stack with the kind of ability or general buffs that your character will have. So for example, Well of Radiance is going to give you 25% just general weapon damage. And if you have something that has Bait and Switch 30% on it, then those two are going to multiply together and become a multiplicative damage modifier for that weapon. So the only time you have to really worry about buffs stacking, if you're into buff stacking, is when you have a perk on the weapon. When you right click on the weapon, it has a perk inside of it that increases its damage. That will stack and work in addition to the general perks from abilities and supers and stuff like that. So that's kind of the general rule. To make it simple, as far as it goes for rating, get the perk on your gun that gives it the highest damage buff, the most magazine size, and then whenever you're in a raid, somebody needs to use a Well or a Ward of Dawn or a Sentinel Shield, and that will give everybody in the team a good buff. Your weapon's going to have a good buff, and the enemy's going to hopefully be debuffed by a tether. That's a general sense of what you need to do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about armor. So armor is going to have a lot of functionality in a raid. It's going to keep you alive, of course, but then it can also modify how much ammo you hold, the handling and the performance of your weapon. It also has some damage things as well. So whenever you're modding your armor, the priority as far as stats go, this is going to change player to player, depending on who you talk to, depending on the class that the player plays. But one thing that you will find universal across pretty much every player in the game is you want your resilience to be at 100, which is the max. Now, the reason you want your resilience to be at 100 is it's going to be giving you a damage reduction from every damage source in the game. To be honest with you, I didn't actually put it on here. I think it's either 30 or 40% of damage reduction from just anything in the game. I think it used to be 40 and it was dropped to 30 not long ago. But it's a substantial damage resistance that you need to take effect of, and it's free. You just have to have that stat on your armor. On all of your armor, you'll have the first slot. You can put any of the 6 stats in there. There's mods that give 10 or 5. So if you find yourself, with your armor only at 50, 60, 70 resilience, you could easily jump that gap and get yourself to 100 and take effect of that damage resistance. Now, the way that you do the other 5 stats, recovery, intellect, discipline, that's completely up to you. As a warlock main, I typically do resilience and then recovery because I love to use my rifts. My rifts work faster, they recharge faster with recovery. But if you are a Titan, you may want to make sure your resilience is at 100 for your barricade to come back. If you play on a build that uses grenades, you might want discipline. However you want to do it. But resilience at 100 is pretty much a baseline across anything in the game, not just raids. So additionally, on your armor, you can have things that modify the acquisition, how frequent, how much it provides of ammo bricks. So whenever you're using a special ammo or a heavy ammo weapon, you're going to, of course, need to get bricks to drop from enemies in order to refill your ammo. Now, on your helmet, you can put ammo finders, and this will actually make it to where the enemies will give a higher chance, or the frequency in which you get drops of ammo for heavy or special will increase. You can actually, I think, stack this up to 3 times. And you could even do 1 of special or heavy, or you could do all 3 of heavy if you could afford it on that helmet. You can also put reserves on your chest piece. So reserves function exactly as they sound. They're going to let you hold additional ammo of a certain type. So for the reserves, it actually has it denoted by the element of the weapon. So if you're using, for example, Gallarhorn or any solar rocket launcher, you would want a solar reserve. You're going to be holding extra solar ammo for your solar rocket or whatever weapon it is. So that's the way that reserves work. Reserves do also stack. Scavengers, the way that scavengers work is that whenever you actually run over a special ammo or a heavy ammo brick in the world, the scavenger is going to make that brick give you more ammo. You're going to get, instead of getting only 1 or 2 shots, you might get 4, 5, or 6 if you have a scavenger mod on. Now, scavengers do not stack, so you can't put 3 scavengers on and get full ammo from 1 brick. Doesn't work like that. You can only use 1 scavenger, and those will go on your boots. Okay, so we've talked about resilience. We've talked about the way that ammo kind of works on your armor. Let's talk a little bit about charged with light. So charged with light is kind of the underlying system of a lot of the mods you're going to be seeing in the armor system in Destiny. The way to understand it in simple terms, in my opinion, is anytime that you see a mod that is green, that is going to be a way that you get a charged with light or an armor stack. I think it was actually renamed to armor stack not long ago, but it used to be called charged with light. So anything that is green is going to be a way that you get a stack of armor charge or charged with light. Anything that is blue is going to be a buff that you have while you have at least one stack of charged with light. So you're going to be getting charges by doing whatever the green mod says. You're going to be getting a buff with the blue mod while you have a stack. And then anything that's yellow will actually just eat or consume all of the stacks that you have to do some kind of effect. Now, one of the examples that is in here that you will probably need to be familiar with is something called surges. So this is exactly tied into the armor charge system. The way that it works is that if you have a charge of light or at least one armor charge, then you can put a mod on your boots that increases how much damage you deal with a certain type of weapon. For example, if I put one if I put one arc surge mod on my boots, then whenever I have one charge with light or one armor charge, I'm going to be dealing 11% more damage with one of those surge mods on my leg. If I put two surges, I'll be dealing 17%. If I put three, I'll be doing 25%. And these surge mods are an example of the blue kind of mod, the blue timer mod. So while I have at least one charge of light, I am going to have a blue buff, a timer buff that gives me plus some type of damage based on how many I have of that mod. So this is going to be something that does not stack with any of these other abilities. So for example, if you have a 25% surge mod, then it's not going to be stacking with Well of Radiance or any of these ones. That is the way that I understand it. If anybody can correct me, please let me know. But generally speaking, surges are going to be something that you want to have on your weapons. And this will just increase your damage as you're running around the encounter, as you're killing ads. And these also work on your primary weapons and your special weapons as well. Charged with Light is a system that has lots of little things you can do. For example, you could make it to where anytime that you pick up an orb of light, you get 2 charges. And anytime that you have those 2 charges, you have a blue buff that gives you faster grenade recharge, more resistance, more mobility. There's lots of different options for how you can do this. An example of one of the yellow consumer mods, a way that this would work, for example, is let's say you've got 2 charges of light and you throw a grenade. There is I think it's called Grenade Kickstart. And basically what will happen is if you throw a grenade, you consume your grenade. If you have 1 stack of charge with light, it's going to take that stack. It's just going to give you a chunk of your grenade back just for free, just for having this kind of set up in your armor. Same thing works with melee. Lots of different ways you can do the charge with light, but the basic breakdown is you're going to generate charges using a green mod that is in your armor. You're going to be getting a buff if you have a charge with any of the blue mods, and then you're going to be consuming all of those charges for some effect with any of the yellow mods. Surge mods are one of the ways you can increase your damage. These goes on your boots. If you put one of them in, you're going to get 11% extra damage if you're charged with light, 17%, 25% if you have 2 or 3 in there. Generally speaking, and then we'll move on. Anytime you're in a Well of Radiance, a Word of Dawn, somebody has a tether, somebody's using a Sentinel shield, there's going to be orbs in the ground. You can very easily set up a system where, hey, I pick up an orb, I get charged. That's a mod that goes on your helmet. And then you can put a surge mod on that says, hey, if I'm charged, I want 11% extra damage with solar weapons, Gallarhorn. And this instantly, just very simply, in my opinion, sets up a system where if you're charged, you're doing 10%, 11% extra damage with a solar weapon. And you can, make this go as all the way to 25 if you want to. There's flexibility within the system. So that's the basics of modding armor. There's lots of different ways you can make builds with different kinds of recharge options. The charged with light is kind of the foundation for how that works. If there's any questions on that, let me know, or anybody in the comments. I'm sure there's lots of people who would be happy to provide feedback or help you out if you're stuck. All right, last thing that we'll talk about is going to be the class armor roles. So earlier, I talked about when you're putting a build together, for a raid encounter or just any kind of hard activity in Destiny, more than likely the armor that you're wearing, the exotic armor piece that you're wearing, you're only allowed to wear one. That exotic armor piece is probably going to be centered around an ability that you have, maybe your super ability, and it can provide various benefits or it can augment how that ability functions. So I've got it broken down here based on the classes in the game and some of the more notable ones that you'll probably see when you're running a raid. And I'll give a brief description of how each of them work. And for a few of them, I went ahead and added some numbers if you're interested in the specific values that these actual change the way the super works. So for the Warlock, Phoenix Protocol. Phoenix Protocol will, when you are standing in a well of radiance, which we've already talked about, when you're in a well of radiance, any kill that you or anybody else gets in your well will recharge your super. You only have to get like 4 or 5 kills and you just get 50% of your super back pretty much immediately. Yeah, this and other super or other exotics in the game used to give you a lot more. These got nerfed probably all the way back in Shadowkeep Beyond Light, but still 50% for just getting a few kills in your super is bonkers. But anyway, that's what Phoenix Protocol does. If you're using Well of Radiance, Phoenix Protocol is always a good option to get it back quickly if you want to spam your wells down and just keep your team alive. Lunafaction boots. Lunafaction is something that's going to pretty much max out the reload speed if somebody is standing in a Well of Radiance or if they're standing in a Healing Rift or an Empowering Rift. So if you're a Warlock and you're putting your rifts down a lot, you're using your Well of Radiance and you want to pretty much max out the reload of all the weapons and everybody standing in there, Lunafaction's a go-to. I don't know technically if it maxes out the reload, but it essentially does. The fastest reload in the game is if you're standing in a Lunafaction Rift. So you want quick reloads. It's going to squeeze out more DPS. So you can use Lunafactions. So Cenotaph, I don't know how to pronounce it, but essentially what this mask does, it's a helmet for the Warlock. If you have a Warlock that's using Divinity, which we've already talked about, or you have a Warlock using any of the trace rifles or little beam rifles, what the Cenotaph is going to do is it's going to mark an enemy that the Warlock is shooting with that trace rifle. And if somebody else on the team gets the killing blow, that enemy will drop a heavy brick for you, and it will drop a green brick for the person using Cenotaph. So it's literally a way to generate ammo if that person's marking priority targets, and you actually have to mark enemies that are either champions or elites. It doesn't work on just regular red bars, but if you're in a boss encounter that has a lot of yellow bars and orange bars, then Cenotaph is something that you can use to generate heavy, generate special pretty reliably. Verity's Brow. So the way this exotic works is if you get kills with weapons or abilities that match the subclass that you're using, it will give you stacks that make your grenade recharge significantly faster. Whenever you throw that grenade, it's going to do increased damage, but it's going to give all of your allies nearby a 10 times grenade recharge rate, which is pretty crazy. If you have a team using a bunch of fusion grenades or healing grenades or weakening grenades, they're going to be getting a lot of grenade recharge just pretty reliably from you just throwing yours. And plus, the grenade that you throw is going to be dealing, I want to say, 100% more damage. I don't know exactly how the stacking works, but the grenade that you throw is going to be a lot chunkier, and it's going to give all the allies nearby a lot more damage, grenade recharge as well. Finally, let's talk about Sunbracers. Sunbracers is something that I actually stumbled upon whenever I was using them in the Root of Nightmares during the Planets Encounter, which Planets Encounter is one of the ones tomorrow, go figure. But Sunbracers, for anybody who doesn't know what they do, you get a kill with your melee ability. You have to be on the solar subclass, I should denote. You get a kill with a melee ability, and for the next 5 seconds, you pretty much have unlimited solar grenades, which I think you can really throw probably 5, maybe 6 if you're lucky. But if you have a whole field of enemies just scorching with these grenades, it also doubles how long they last, the grenades. Sunbracers are a very effective way to clear ads. There's mods in the Charge with Light system that allow you to get your grenade and your melees back quicker. You could even generate orbs with your grenades. You can get super energy with your grenades. Stun bracers are very, very good for just controlling the battlefield in a raid encounter. All right, so moving on to the Hunter. So the Hunter Orpheus rig, if you are a Hunter who's using Tether for the weaken effect, Orpheus rig functions pretty much the same way that Phoenix does for Warlocks, except you don't have to kill them. You just have to have them get stuck to your Tether. So if you're using the Orpheus rig and you shoot it into a clump of enemies, every enemy that gets grabbed by that Tether will essentially give you a chunk of your super back. If you do it on beefier enemies or bosses, you get a little bit more per enemy tethered. But Orpheus is a good go-to if you're using it in environments where there's lots of ad saturation. If you're fighting a boss that has 2 or 3 things standing next to him, Orpheus is going to be very, very good for you. You'll get your super back pretty quickly. Now, Lucky Pants is the next one. This is probably the one that will require the most amount of depth and explanation to understand how it works, but once you understand it, it's not that hard. So Lucky Pants are a pair of boots for the hunter, excuse me. And the way that these work is if you're using a hand cannon, yes, a primary hand cannon or a secondary hand cannon, if you have a hand cannon that takes green bricks, which there is one of in the game, essentially when you pull out that hand cannon, you ready it. Whenever you shoot your first shot for the next 5 seconds, every shot that you shoot is going to deal 60% more damage than the last shot. And this is going to stack all the way to 600% damage. So basically for 5 seconds, you can deal nuclear levels of damage with a hand cannon. If you're using a hand cannon that fires rapidly fast, such as Crimson, if you have Malfeasance, which has just a lot of ammo in it, the faster firing hand cannons are going to be able to do just insane, like I said, nuclear, ungodly amounts of damage with a hand cannon. And this can be a legendary hand cannon. You could use this to do like a damage opener. You know, you could have a boss that becomes damageable, pull out your hand cannon, 5 seconds. 5 seconds go by and you just deal an absolute chunk of damage, and then swap to your exotic heavy or your heavy weapon and then deal damage the normal way. Lucky Pants is a way for hunters who aren't using, I mean, you could even use Tether. You can use anything you want, but as long as you're using hand cannon, you've got Lucky Pants on, you can do just some crazy, crazy damage with a primary weapon. And it's not going to take away from your super. You can use any super with it. It's not going to take away from, you know, the heavy weapon you can use. So Lucky Pants is just a crazy damage option for hunters. So Star Eater scales. These are another pair of boots, and the way that these work is they will allow you to pick up orbs of light. And when you pick up an orb in Destiny, it gives you a small percentage of your super back. But orbs of light will actually give you double what they would normally give you if you have Star Eaters. So you're going to be getting your super back much quickly. Additionally, once you have a super fully charged, it lets you actually continue to pick up orbs of light. If you pick up, I think, 4 additional orbs of light, your super, when you fire it, will give you an overshield, and it's going to be dealing 70% more damage if it is a damage dealing super, such as a golden gun, or if you have the Arc Staff Gathering Storm super, you can throw that. It's going to be dealing 70% more damage. Or if you are going to be hitting an enemy directly, direct impact with a tether, then it will have that deal 70% increased damage as well. So Star Eaters is just fast supers if there's lots of orbs on the ground, and your super is going to deal a lot more damage. That's pretty much how it works. Finally, for the hunter, we'll talk about Celestial Nighthawk. So Celestial Nighthawk works with Golden Gun. So instead of having normally 3 precision shots you can shoot with a Golden Gun, Celestial Nighthawk gives you 1 shot, and that 1 shot will deal 650% normal damage. And I think the math checks out to being about 70% more than if you were to be using the 3 headshot version of Golden Gun. So Celestial Nighthawk is good. If that shot is a killing blow, it gives you about 1/3 of your super back. It also makes that enemy explode. Also, if you're wearing Celestial Nighthawk, any headshot kill or precision kill that you get will actually give you a few extra percent points on your super. So you can get quick golden guns, and you can get 1 just super crazy shot with golden gun that does a lot of damage. All right, finally, we'll talk about Titan, and then we'll wrap up. So Titan I again play Titan the least of the three. I do have a max level Titan, but as long as the game has been out now, who doesn't at this point? But as far as Titan, some of the more notable exotics, Curious of the Falling Star. So this is going to be for people who use Thunder Crash, which is the one-off super. Curious of the Falling Star just doubles the amount of damage that does. So if you see somebody using Thunder Crash and Curious, they're going to be hitting for, like I said, several 100,000 on a normal enemy, which is a pretty big jump in damage for them. Easy, just one-off damage. It doesn't take more than 3 seconds to use, and then they're back to damage phase. So easy way to chunk damage. Phoenix Cradle is a exotic that will make sunspots. So there's a mechanic on Titans who use the solar subclass where they will create these sunspots just all across the map. They damage enemies, they heal guardians that stand in them. And then with Phoenix Cradle, they will actually give you increased regeneration of your abilities. And I think the healing is actually what comes from Phoenix Cradle. I think normally sunspots don't give guardians anything, but if you wear Phoenix, it gives healing, it gives ability regen. So Phoenix is a very good support exotic for Titans. So Helm of Saint 14 is a helmet, of course, and it makes the Ward of Dawn. When you normally walk into a Ward of Dawn, the bubble, the shield that you get when you go in there does not permeate, it does not go with you when you come out. However, with the Helm of Saint 14, you are going to be getting an overshield when you step into the bubble. When you go out of the bubble, you're going to continue to have that overshield. So it basically turns the bubble from a lockdown super to a super that gives a little bit more mobility and flexibility. As Guardians can freely walk in and out of the bubble and keep that overshield with them. Additionally, if there's any enemies that walk into the bubble when you have Helm on, then they're going to become blinded, disoriented. So it turns that lockdown super where it's very hard to die in the bubble to pretty much impossible. Ursa Furiosa. So if you have somebody that's using the Sentinel Shield version of the Void Titan, where they're holding that shield up and giving what appears to be the strongest damage buff in the game, if somebody's using that, they need to use Ursa Furiosa, because Ursa Furiosa essentially just takes any of the damage that they block while they're holding that shield, and it will give them their super back. I didn't actually put the number on here, but it is actually 50% at maximum. So if they block a good amount of damage, then they are going to be getting 50% of the shield back, their super back, just immediately off the rip, just for standing there blocking damage and supporting the team. So Ursa Furiosa functions very similar to the other support supers, where it will give the Titan that super back, a big chunk of it back, just for using it. Finally, another notable mention. Again, I don't main Titan, so this list probably is the least complete. There may be Titans out there who can think of a few other ones that are much more beneficial than what I've got here, but again, this is from me. Stronghold. So Stronghold is a Titan set of gauntlets that will actually allow them to hold a sword, the blocking of a sword, indefinitely. Whenever they're holding it, they will get restoration if they block damage at a correct time. So Stronghold, I've seen it used in a few niche cases. For example, I used it during the day 1 Crota's End raid, and what we had a Titan doing is basically, if you're blocking with a sword and you have these on, you're not going to die. That's the general gist of it. It's very hard to kill a Titan blocking with Stronghold. And the reason is, normally when you block with a sword, it will kind of take down that duration. You can't block forever. You take a little bit of damage even if you do get hit. Stronghold, none of that happens. You can hold it forever. You're not going to take damage from the front, and plus there's a way you can heal yourself if you block and use it correctly. So you could have somebody just taking the aggression of a boss away from you. They could just stand at that boss with Ursa, or stand at that boss with Stronghold, excuse me, and that boss is just going to target them, and they're just going to be literally a tank, just tanking the boss while the rest of you are solving a mechanic or preparing for damage. So Stronghold, I believe, is also a notable mention. It's a little bit more niche, but if you have somebody who's willing to use it and take the aggro from a boss, Stronghold's an option. All right, I think with that, that's everything. If you take away anything from me, it would be communicate with your team, because more than likely there's going to be people there who have more knowledge than you. There's going to be people I raid with tomorrow that probably know things that I don't. Be considerate of people who do ask these questions, because you at one point did not know the answer either. And I would also say that as far as, what you need to take away from an understanding perspective, understand that, there are supers and abilities in the game that are very supportive, that function very, very efficiently in these kinds of raid environments. You could go into these environments using the supers such as Storm Trance. You could go into them using, certain supers like the Night Stalker Hunter, or excuse me, the Night Stalker Blades. I can't even think of what they're called. You can go in here using the Mobile Thunder Crash. But in these raid type environments, really you need to be playing for the sake of the team. You need to be using these support type supers. A raid group that has, 2 or 3 Well of Radiances and 2 or 3 Tethers is not unheard of. You will have multiple. I would actually say it's recommended to have multiple of these supers available in the event that you have a long damage phase. Maybe one person doesn't have their super when they need to. So don't feel dissuaded in having multiple of these supers up. You'll find that multiple day one winners of the raid races have multiple of these subclasses stacked up. So go in using the correct abilities. Make sure that if you're using Will of Radiance, if you're using Tether, Ward of Dawn, if you're using these supers, make sure you have good exotics to pair with them. If you don't, ask. And then also a general sense as far as buffs and stuff. Go in there making sure you have a general sense of how buff stacking works. One debuff on an enemy, pretty much only one buff on you is going to be how it works. Don't try to stack and do the math in your head, because most of the time you don't have to worry about it. And then finally, the last thing I'll leave you with is understand, what kind of perks and mods need to go on your armor. If somebody says pull out, legendary rocket launcher, if somebody says I have Gallarhorn, somebody says I'm using Gallarhorn, the expectation of that player is that everybody else is going to be using probably a rocket launcher, and that rocket launcher needs to have some good perks on it. If you have a rocket launcher that has chain reaction or impulse amplifier and it doesn't have anything like demolition, like, you can get by. This is an activity. Raids will get progressively harder as time goes on, but have an idea of the best perks and kind of things you want to have on these weapons, because this is one of the events in Destiny. This is the final point. I'll let you go. This is the one of the events in Destiny where what you have actually matters in the activity. For the longest chunks of time in Destiny, more often than not, the activities in the game, the things you can do, it doesn't really matter what you're using. You can beat, I would say, 99% of the game using anything you want. The Pantheon event starting tomorrow is going to be one of those instances where really understanding how the game works is going to showcase, and it's going to improve the enjoyment you're going to have of the game. This is one of the instances where there's a genuine challenge in the game. It's going to get harder week after week after week after week until we are doing, we are severely underleveled. We have 8 bosses back to back to back to back, some of the hardest bosses in the game. And if you don't have the kind of experience and knowledge to go into those fights effectively and, help the team, then, you might be looked at as somebody who needs to get kicked. And I hope that doesn't happen to you. There's people out there. Trust me, I'm not one of them. But I do digress. Let me know if this helped. Feel free to screenshot this. Look at this anytime you want to. Ask questions in the comment section. I will be doing Pantheon. I'll probably record the Pantheon efforts that I have tomorrow. If you want more information on what Pantheon is, again, just a TLDR, back-to-back-to-back raid encounters for some of the best bosses in Destiny 2. Every week, there's going to be 2 extra bosses added until week 4, where it's going to have 8 bosses. And then every week, the power level is going to also increase as well. So we are going to be 20 levels under power, 8 bosses by week 4. So tomorrow is the easiest version of Pantheon. We will see what exactly the easiest version looks like. But I can tell you right now that if you're somebody who wants to do it, by all means, LFG, there's the fire team finder in the game to find a group. Hopefully some of this knowledge here helped you kind of understand what you should look for on weapons, what kind of supers, what kind of exotics you should use. If you have any questions about it, let me know. And I hopefully wish you the best of luck in Pantheon and any of the raiding that you intend on doing. And I will hopefully see you all again soon. Thank you.